Welcome everyone to another episode of Podium Stories. Today we have a very special guest in the building. His name is Andy Raskin. He helps CEOs align their teams around a strategic narrative to power success in sales, marketing, fundraising, product, and recruiting. He has a wide range of clients, including venture-backed companies funded by Andreessen Horowitz, First Round Capital, GV, and other top investors. And he's also led strategic narrative training at Salesforce, Uber, Square, Yelp, and plenty of other very successful companies. Andy, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Oh, great. Thanks for having me on, Marty.
Absolutely. So I want to, we were talking off camera, but the idea behind today's episode is to talk a lot about stories and strategic narrative, right? What makes a company and a personal brand have a good story that resonates with the public and that actually produces measurable results. To give our listeners a bit of context, when we talk about strategic narrative, what are we talking about?
Yeah, great question. And this is something that I've come to kind of over the years. It sounds like what we're talking about is the company story, or like, and of course we are, but the way I like to define strategic narrative is from the frame of the buyer. So how to make people make decisions. There's a lot of debate about this, even in, sort of among people who study this stuff. But I really find the side that says we do it basically based on a story in our heads. So there's a story in our heads about kind of we've observed the world and taken out of it certain patterns. And from those patterns, we come up with, okay, well, this is what you have to do to thrive. This is where you have to go. And this is what creates urgency in our life. And I call that story in the buyer's head, or any human's head, but buyer also, their strategic narrative. So the narrative, the story that guides the actions of a person that's in their head.
Right. And something that I was very interested in is your process about finding that story and identifying that narrative. So when you're working with a company or with the CEO or their leadership team, what type of questions and exercises do you make them run through, or how do you find their story that will resonate with their market? What's your process to find that?
Yeah. It's always evolving, and I've been doing this now for about 6-7 years, and I'm always sort of changing it a little bit. But I've written a bunch of posts about the basic framework and the pieces of this story. One is called "The Greatest Sales Deck I've Ever Seen." It's using Zuora, it's a Silicon Valley B2B company as their sales narrative as an example. I've written some others that go into other companies and how they do it. And the core of the framework is what I call the change in the world. And the change in the world, I've come to express through what I call old game and new game. Yep. So what is the old game and what is the new game? This shift, if we look at the companies that really break out, it's usually that they're starting with some articulation of this. You could think of this as a why now, although they don't even really label it that way. It just kind of functions this way. And if you think about it, this really is the way a person, navigates the world. Like we look at things, we notice when, oh wow, things are changing. Maybe I have to adapt my way, and so they're trying to kind of make sense of the buyer's world in this very compact way through the shift. And so your question is really about how do we get to that shift and how do we identify it? I used to see myself as a kind of like creative agency where I'm gonna, interview the team, hey, what's going on? I might talk to customers, and then I'll go back to my cave and I'll write it up. Right. I'll write up what I think it should be. I'll bring it back to them. Hey, what do you think of this? And they would say, oh, we don't like this. We kind of like that. I go back to my cave. I redo it, kind of come back, going back and forth like this for a long time. And it was okay when I worked that way. But something happened. So it was a few years into that. Actually, it was right around the time I published that post about Zuora.
Yep.
Got very popular, and I started getting a lot of demand for working with CEOs and their teams. And this way of working was okay. It was slow, but that was okay. But it happened to be very slow. And so this one CEO said to me, "Listen, Andy, I've read all your posts. I don't want to wait 4 months to start a project with you. We don't have that much time. How about this? How about we do this? We do the same process you usually do, except instead of you going back to your cave, I'll go back to my cave and I'll build it. And I just can call you whenever I want." And I was like, well, that's not going to work because I'm kind of the genius who does the story thing. So, but this guy was very persuasive, and I decided to try it. And you can probably imagine what happened. Like, the result was way better than anything that I had done to that time. Not only was it just, it was less of me. It was actually not, I wouldn't say less work for me, because it was a lot of work being with him, like in this very kind of, I would say almost intimate way, like of going through this stuff in many, many hours. But his team owned it in a way that I hadn't seen before. And that convinced me eventually, like, that should be my model. And so I won't go into all the details of how I work with teams, but basically it's a balance of having that CEO be the author of it.
Okay.
And having their leadership team being able to weigh in and impact its direction. So they're bought in too. And it's kind of balancing those two things.
Makes sense. You talk about the old game and the new game. And I remember reading a story of yours about the day before running a marathon, I believe, and having a speaker talk about carbo loading. And you talk about attacking the old game, naming the new game. So I have a couple of questions on that. The first one is an enemy necessary to always create a good story? Or can we have a story that just has the positive side of the naming the new game or going forward without having somebody or something that we attack?
Yeah. I believe that the most effective is where there's something we're attacking.
Right.
And that's not to say that the enemy is a metaphor.
Right, for sure.
So we don't doesn't literally have to be a person or a thing. In fact, I would say better if it's not. What it really is an old mindset. So if you look at that Zuora story I mentioned, Zuora sells us this subscription billing platform, and the new game, they say, is subscription in all its different variations. Whereas the old game was, transactions, like you're going to sell stuff to people,
right,
and people are going to buy them outright. And they're basically saying, hey, that was a great game for a long time, eons. And now we're shifting to where if you're playing that game, if that's your mindset, then you're losing. So the enemy, quote unquote, is this old mindset within the buyer. Like we said, we're trying to replace the strategic narrative inside the buyer's head. So the enemy is that old strategic narrative, and what we're championing is a new strategic narrative, new game.
Yeah, I like how you called it. I believe it was like the buyer operating narrative. I thought that made a lot of sense. It was interesting because when I was doing the research, Andy, I learned a lot. Like, it made me think so much about my own business and like, what are we doing? Because we don't have the clear story. We have a personal story, which we do a lot of personal branding, and we generate all our business from my own personal brand. So that's good. And I have my own story. But I was thinking, right, like what's the old game, what's the new game for us? So that was something that was very important while I was like preparing for this interview.
And I'm guessing, it probably has something to do with CEOs having to have personal brands, or even maybe all executives having to create personal brand is a phrase that inspires love and hate. So it's up to you whether you use it.
I don't like it too much. I just say it because it's usually what's most easy to say.
But we know what we're talking about. I mean, I think the bigger thing is that there's this shift to where every company is really a media company. And that really means that every executive, in particular the CEO, is an actor, but is a celebrity or a personality that needs to create an audience. A great example of this, not a CEO, but Dave Gerhardt of Drift and now Privy. He is very active, so active in creating his own audience through his like paid newsletters and channels, Patreon, all this stuff, that I think a lot of CEOs or companies would shut that down.
Right.
Like the traditional model is like, you can't do that. That's like, you're on our time. And what people like him, and he's now turning his CEO into a personality with an audience through another podcast and all the rest. And that's all about this shift of like, hey, that's no longer like cheating on personal time. That's like, this is the way we're going to build an audience so we can actually talk to them about what we want to when it's time to do that too.
Absolutely. So something that really also caught my eye was, and gave me great food for thought, was when you talk about category naming, right? Like, so Drift did conversational marketing, right? So myself, I was also thinking we should do that, right? Why are we not like trying to own a category that differentiates that and gives us a better narrative compared to other content creation agencies? So I thought that was very interesting how you talk about, old game, new game, and turning that into category naming, right? Like the new game is a new brand in itself. Andy, like I was saying off camera, I think there's some way that we both like are in the same field, more or less. So I want to ask you about content creation and strategic narrative. So is that content creation is the next step after you define the strategic narrative, or how do these two entities play within each other?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, one of the points I made, I've tried to make it a lot. I think I made it in that post about Zuora and other places. Just defining the strategic narrative, making a sales deck about it. That's how that's, I think, very powerful to define it. But that's not going to create that replace the strategic narrative in the buyer's mind. Replace that old one with your new one just by itself. Right. So you have to be out there and telling that one story over and over and over. So I hear a lot of like, oh, the 7 stories a brand has to tell, or the 10 stories a CEO has to tell. And that's fine. Like there's probably good reasons for telling those stories. The way I like to look at it is that all of the content, if we're, really gonna like to get the most out of it, has to basically be telling one story. If you look at Zuora, because I'll say that just because we've used their example now a couple of times, pretty much everything they're talking about is a kind of, so actually the CEO of Zuora said this to me he's going to be on my podcast. I'll be coming out tomorrow. He's like, we have the high level story and then we have these sub flavors of the story. And so the shift is the story, the shift from transactions to subscription. But then, well, okay, how does that play out for CIOs, for example? How does that, for the different roles? How does that play out in different industries? I mean, just answering those questions is probably like years of content right there. And, but it's all about that. And when you make that story the thing that drives all the content, one nice thing that happens is, you can be championing things that happen in the world that aren't that are done by people who are not your customers. So, for instance, when Zuora first started talking about the subscription economy, they're talking about companies like Airbnb, and hey, look at what Airbnb is doing. Look at what Netflix is doing. I don't believe these companies were, not all of them anyway, were clients of theirs, but they were champions of this club of the new game. And that's really what we're looking to do. And so, word category is like a loaded word, because what does it mean? I mean, to create a category, does it mean that Gartner makes a quadrant about you? Or like, how do you know you've created a category? Who cares? I mean, the big thing is the narrative, and getting, even those examples like conversational marketing, or, what Benioff did with cloud CRM. It's a good argument to say these are not really categories quite. They're kind of movements that people say they want to join. And so content is this, is the art, is the propaganda arm of the new story, and hugely important.
Right. I was thinking before the episode, if somebody, when you're talking to a potential new client, has he told you, okay, but how do we measure the ROI of the strategic narrative of this new story? Like, what are some of the differences that we're going to see? And I understand that there might not be an immediate ROI, that like a Facebook ad that you can put $1 and get $3 back. But what do you answer when somebody tells you, okay, but what's the results that we should be seeing from a new strategic narrative?
Well, first of all, when I engage with teams, I would say I almost never hear this question.
That's because you work with good clients.
Well, I work with people who they've just come to this place where they start to really, usually it's around there's a transition from, hey, we've achieved a lot of success, to where we're going to be transitioning to blowing it out and growing.
Right.
One CEO said to me, we've achieved a lot of success, but it's been like brute force of the founders, meaning the founders were like in every sales call and all that. And hey, if it was going to continue like that, I don't need you, Andy. We got this. But now we're going to be hiring, hundreds of salespeople and investing a lot in marketing and content. And there's this realization that, hey, I gotta make it clear to everybody what's this kind of North Star that we should all be aligning to. And so I don't hear that from them. What I can say is, of course, over the years, I've had some teams have been very detailed about measuring, or very good about measuring differences after we started to roll this out. One of the reasons, so the main instrument that I build with teams is the sales deck. So the sales deck is really the core of the narrative. It's the instrument by which we're defining the narrative. And one reason I do that is sort of related to your question, which is, where's the most important place for this narrative to have to work? It's got to be in a sales call. And so, usually usually it's the opposite. It's like, oh, let's have marketing or content, whatever, build some story, and then, maybe try to get sales to tell that. And this is the opposite. Sales is going to help build the story and test it. And then we'll have everyone, including even product, like, okay, let's adopt that as the story we're going to be telling and building product for and all the rest. But one of the teams, so I'll give you, usually one of the things when people do measure it, sales cycle duration is one of the things I hear most commonly. So that people are just able to get it, and that the strategic narrative is building urgency. What is the biggest reason people are not buying or dragging their feet? It's not a competitor. It's the status quo. Is old game is too like attached in their brain. It's like it can't be pried loose.
Right.
And so this strategic narrative is all about that. And so that's the biggest one. I then have heard other figures. Andy Wilson is the CEO of a company called Logical. He did a lot of this tracking. And one of the things he told me was that he tracked the time it would take for a new rep to close a new deal. So, get up to speed enough to where they close the deal, right? And that had been like 60 days, 90 days, and then they slashed that in half to 30 days, and lower even, I think it got as well. So, those kind of sales, how quick is it? How quick are they getting it? Those are some of the early ones. And then I think, as you're saying, it just starts to permeate everything, and it becomes very difficult to measure it directly.
Because there's so many moving parts, right? Like, and I'm guessing to define it, you're probably talking with like customers, sales, marketing, product. Like, there's so many moving pieces that it's hard to, because content is similar. Maybe not. It's not that abstract because you're actually creating like articles and LinkedIn and Twitter and all that, and you can see like impressions. But there's still a component of brand narrative, right? Like you're building brand equity that's hard to measure.
Of course, yeah.
I did have a personal question to ask you. You tweeted the other day about you were about to meet a CEO, I believe, and you said, even after all this time, I still get nervous. Can I really help these smart people get to the right story? Right? I related a lot to that because when I started working with CEOs, I was 21, right out of college, talking like I was in Barcelona at that time. I was basically broke, just was good at creating content. And I was talking to these multi-million-dollar individuals and I was scared. For 2 years, I was very scared. So tell me a bit more about how you're fighting or how you deal with that sensation of like, I need to help these very smart individuals because you've been doing it for so long. So I was wondering, what's your mindset when you're approaching those calls, when you're approaching that engagement?
It really boils down to faith and just hope or trusting in the process and experience, and sure enough, that's exactly what happened. This engagement, by the way, fingers crossed, not computer, has turned out to be one of the best ever. And the CEO, I think the reason it's scary is because I'm like, well, I know kind of basically about their business. These seem like really smart people. How am I going to come up with it in a way that they couldn't? Also, it's sort of one thing that happens often is I go into the engagements with a kind of guess as to what the story is going to be.
Got it.
Like it seems kind of obvious, and I'm virtually always wrong. And so I was like, how am I going to be wrong about this one? How come they don't just see it, And of course, like just right from the very beginning, I kind of put it out there a little bit, like, what about this? And it became clear right away, like why that was wrong. And through the conversations, and I really do think this was a combination of the CEO's experience and wisdom and openness, and her trust in this process, and my experience of bringing some options to the table through some of my experience that led us to a totally unexpected place that I didn't expect to go to, and that so far has really resonated. The way I work is we build it and then we start testing it in sales, calls, and we're about to start that. So, like I said, fingers crossed. But there's a lot of just trusting that it's gonna happen. Almost like, you ever do improv?
I love to do stand-up comedy. It's not the
same. Oh, you do?
Oh,
cool. Yeah, same thing. It's like just trusting in the partner and trusting whatever, and then changing stuff on the fly if you have to.
I have one last question, super short, because I want to be respectful of your time. Like I said, before we start an engagement with a client, we do a kickoff call where we try to understand what they're about, what the content should focus around these areas. Can you give me like one or it's like a very mini version of what you do, I guess, because we only have 30 minutes. But can you give me like one or two questions that you would ask to really understand a business, or that I should be asking on that kickoff call?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, my approach is not so much me as an information gatherer, but me as trying to get them to start thinking about it and getting the CEO to start crafting this him or herself. And well, one of the questions is just that question we've been talking about. What is the big shift in the world? I wrote a public post about the questions that I have CEOs and their teams ask customers that feed into this work. And with customers, it's hard, we can't just ask them directly, but one of the ways that we get to this is I say, hey, how have we changed your life? Or how did this company change your life? And, sometimes they'll laugh, like, whatever, but sometimes they'll cry and let me tell you, of course, those are the ones we want to know about. Well, we want to know about both, but these are the ones that give us good fertile territory for the story stuff. And so then next question I have the team ask them is, well, how has the world changed in just the last few years so that whatever you're talking about is so much more valuable than it would have been before, And sometimes the way I'll do it is I'll ask the team this. I'll say, hey, if I were to ask a customer how you change their life, what might they say?
Right.
And then I'll ask them, well, what would they say if I asked them, why that's more valuable now? And that starts to get usually some good stuff out that is talking about the change. The way most people are trained and sort of brought up to think about this is, my customer has a problem, I have a solution, let me tell you why the solution is better. And that's not the way that strategic narratives get put in someone's head. That gets put in someone's head by someone observing something in the world has changed. There's this great quote by the great screenwriter Robert McKee, screenwriting guru Robert McKee, who says, I'm going to paraphrase, but our brains are wired to notice change. So if there's many things going on around us, but they're sort of stable, and then the temperature changes, that's what we notice. We're sort of animals that are looking on the lookout for this. And so if we can structure the story as changed, it's usually a good place to start.
Andy, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I think we could talk for a couple hours, but I appreciate you being here. We're going to link to your Twitter and LinkedIn, to your website as well. I do think you provide an invaluable service, and I'm happy we had the chance to talk.
Great. Yeah, it's great meeting you, Marty, and to learn about it seems like we're kind of really interested in a lot of similar stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andy. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.